Russia will be getting an economic boost while the U.S. is still struggling in an emergency situation, you could call it. So usually when there's an emergency, you call 911, right? Well, if you're a big bank, you call the Federal Reserve, and they come to the rescue with $9 trillion in loans. That's what happened back in 2008 at the height of the financial crisis. So why are we just finding out about this now? Well, because it was done without congressional approval, without disclosure to the public, and somehow without breaking any rules. Karl Denninger, author of The Market Ticker, is in Niceville, Florida. And Karl, this is being talked about as an overnight emergency loan. Overnight meaning suddenly and behind closed doors. Is this really just par for the course when it comes to the way this system works?
Well, there's existing in the Federal Reserve's charter is this arcane section called 13.3, which allows them under unusual and exigent circumstances to make loans to anybody for any reason that they deem to be appropriate. So they could actually have loaned you money to buy a car, provided that they declared that there was an unusual and exigent circumstance. And that was the excuse that was used in order to make these loans during that period of time.
Seems interesting to have rules when we just have other rules to get around them. But, you know, I know you've written extensively about this. And even with this huge dump of information, that there's still a lot of information not being reported. Give us the breakdown of some of the truth behind these numbers and what it all means.
Well, the most striking this are, in some areas, things that we already knew. For example, a huge beneficiary of these programs, including the Federal Reserve's monetization of debt, were not American banks, they were foreign banks. And this was especially true for the agency securities, that is, the mortgage-backed stuff that the Federal Reserve bought in 2009. The more interesting thing to me, though, is the fact that the Federal Reserve demanded collateral on these loans that in some cases had a face value of 10 times what they loaned out. And what that essentially means is that they were taking trash from these banks as security for this money that they were handing them. And the question that this raises is, where did those assets go after they were given back? Because they haven't been written off. So if the banks are still holding these things, what are they holding them at a value of today? And are the banks, in fact, insolvent right now if we were to look at them in light of the valuations that the Federal Reserve applied just a year ago?
Certainly a question not a lot of people seem to be asking. But again, I want to emphasize here, we are talking about $9 trillion. So real quick, we found something fun just to show our viewers what $1 trillion looks like.
Thanks to the current bailout, trillion is the new billion. When you look at it, it doesn't seem all that big, but it's a huge number. What's the economic impact of $1 trillion bucks? Imagine this. For $1 trillion, you can buy a $3 latte every day for 900 million years. $1 trillion is greater than the Australian GDP. It's enough to buy up every stock on the Toronto Stock Exchange. With $1 trillion, you can fund the militaries of all the NATO countries combined. Or you
Suddenly $700 billion seems to be like pocket change. But Karl, what do you say to those who argue, you know, hey, these loans were needed. They were a lifeboat to keep this economy from drowning. Everyone's back on dry land, and the loans have been repaid. So was there anything wrong with this, really?
Well, were they repaid, and have we, in fact, just handed back the bad collateral to the banks and given them money to tide them over for a couple of months or 6 months or a year, and left them, in fact, in no better circumstances than they were back in 2008? And that's the problem, is we don't know. And without knowing where that collateral went, because that's clearly where the problem was. If you had to give somebody $185 billion worth of paper in order to get $15 billion in cash, that $185 billion in paper wasn't really worth $185 billion now, was it?
Very good point. And real briefly, I want to contrast this situation that we're finding out about now with what's going on now. We've got Congress arguing about extending unemployment benefits for those Americans who are without work, without an income, and yet these big banks, the wealthiest companies, and by the way, many of them are to blame for the economic avalanche, all they have to do is make a quick phone call, and all is fixed. So what is the message that this sends, the picture that this paints here?
Well, the message is that these institutions went to Congress and to the Federal Reserve and to Treasury and said, give us this money or we're going to collapse, and when we do, there will be tanks in the streets and you will have martial law, and Congress bought it. When you have 20 million Americans that are running out of unemployment benefits, they say, well, you know, you've had 99 weeks, you should have gone and got a job. And there's a point to that because you can't just keep handing out money forever. But the question that I have to ask is this. The banks have paid out somewhere over $100 billion in compensation in bonuses and salaries this year. These are the same banks that created the problem. So if we had resolved them and taken them into receivership, shut them down, that would be $100 billion that would still be floating around somewhere in the economy, and that could be siphoned off through taxation or whatever have you, and maybe these people would have jobs instead of being on the unemployment rolls.
Certainly an interesting idea in response to these jaw-dropping numbers. Karl Denninger with the market ticker.